I want to thank Jeff and Rod and the organizers for having me back once again for the third time. And today we're going to talk about a new hypothesis of obesity. And it's really not a new hypothesis, it's just kind of my idea of why I think we got to where we are. I have no disclosures, no financial interest in anything I'm going to talk about today. I want to show you this thing because when we were out promoting protein power, you see this at every obesity conference you go to, this little map from the CDC showing the growth of obesity. And I wasn't going to put this in, but then I noticed that nobody else showed it, so I thought, heck, there are probably people that haven't seen it. So it's really interesting and kind of mortifying. But you can see the growth of obesity in all the states. Now, I've ended this in 1996 because that's when we wrote Protein Power. And we thought when we wrote Protein Power that we were going to stop the obesity epidemic. And so we'll see how that worked out. Now, this was when we were promoting Protein Power, this was the slide that I always used. This was the end slide of this progression you just saw. And 3 states had turned yellow where over 20% of the population was obese. And so I thought, God, this is terrible. But little did I know, is it just keeps on going. And the only thing I can say in our defense for not stemming the tide is the last place to convert was Colorado, which is where we were living when Protein Power came out. So, but unfortunately, even it succumbed. So, I mean, this is a pretty graphic display of obesity, but I want to show you another one because I did just a little experiment. I went on Google and I looked back at sororities and fraternities in the 50s, before there was really an obesity epidemic. At that time, obesity had held steady forever. And I picked sororities and fraternities because I could pick people that were about the same socioeconomic class both times, and also people who hadn't had a chance to smoke, because a lot of people say, well, people were more obese or are more obese now than then because not as many people smoke, and everybody smoked back then. So I wanted to get people young before smoking could make a lot of difference. So this is a picture, you can go on Google and find any of these. This is a picture of a sorority in the 1950s. This is in Louisiana, this is LSU in fact, and these girls are on a camp out, and I picked this one specifically because they're in shorts and you can see what they look like. But that was in the 1950s. And all these women, I'm sure, ate carbohydrates. Okay, they weren't on low-carb diets. They ate carbohydrates. They had toast for breakfast. Every house in America had a toaster, and that's what they looked like in 1950. If you look at fraternities in 1950, and again, these are all on Google, fraternities on 1950, they're harder to see because the fraternity guys are all dressed up. This is interesting because this picture up in the upper right is a group of college musicians in 1897. And you can see between 1897 and 1950, there really hasn't been any change because there wasn't a big change in obesity since 1897 and the 1950s. If you look down at the lower right, you can see some guys with their shirts off, so you can see what they look like, and you can see one overweight guy. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't any obesity back in the 1950s, because there was, but it wasn't very common. And in each group, you would find one obese person, one overweight person. Every schoolroom, every classroom that I was in had one kid that was chubby, and it was usually a boy. But that's what it was like back in the 1950s before this obesity epidemic took off. Now, if you look at kids in the 50s, here's one on the left, pretty typical picture, a bunch of skinny little kids and one big old heavy kid. Now, this is an interesting picture because a lot of people in this room know one of the people in this picture, and everybody in the room knows another person in the picture. Now, if you look down at the lower left, that's my lovely wife when she was about 2.5, okay? And she's one of the little skinny ones. And the one big fat kid in the back, I'll show you this picture about 4 years later, the same group of kids. And there's the big fat kid in the back. And down on the lower left is my wife with her hair all cut off. And that's her brother behind her. And in the middle is Roger Clinton, and that's her sister. Remember Roger Clinton and his band? So that's Bill back in the 50s. So now this is really what's happened. Now, I had major angst about doing this because I didn't want to fat shame anybody. A lot of these kids may see this. This video is going to be disseminated. So I was trying to figure out a way to get the point across without actually identifying people. So this is what I did. I kind of cut the tops off people. But you can see just looking at the legs, the difference. See how much heavier young girls are now than they were back in 1950. And there's a comparison. If you look at fraternities, you see not as bad, but see how all the guys are chunky? They're not long and lean. And I didn't cherry pick these pictures. You go to Google, put in fraternities 2015 pictures, same thing with sororities, and you'll see all these pictures and others. There they are again. They don't look as bad as the girls, but you can't tell because they've got more clothes on. And here's, again, fraternities in the 50s, and there's that one with the one overweight kid. So what happened? What changed in this time? Because as I say, there have been obese people all along, but all of a sudden, it just exploded. So that's what I want to talk about a little bit, about what I think happened and what the mechanism behind it is. So let's look at micronutrient intake over time. Now this is a kind of the slide that I use to promote protein power, because it shows micronutrients as a percentage of calories, which I think is a dumb way to do it, but that's what everybody did back then. And they told everybody that if you could get your fat below 30%, you could eat everything you want and you would never gain weight. So it was all a matter of percentage of calories. Every label you looked on it would say fat. Oh, it's 28%. I can eat all this I want. I won't gain weight. And if you see on this chart, you can see that the carbs have gone up, fat intake has gone down as a percentage of nutrient intake. Proteins remained about the same, so you could make a great case for the low-carb diet. Look, carbs have gone up, fat's gone down, everybody's getting fat. Fat doesn't make you fat, it's got to be carbs. Buy my low-carb book. And so here's another graph that actually shows grams per day that's a little bit more revealing. And it shows that the top line is carbohydrate intake. And you can see that in about 76 to 80, it just skyrocketed. It went up about 240 calories. And if you look at fat and protein, they're superimposed, but fat's got 9 grams per calorie. 9 calories per gram, protein's got 4. So there were a lot more calories of protein than you see there in the protein. You would think from looking at this graph. What's amazing is just the increase in carbohydrate intake. And why is that? Why would people have started eating carbohydrates all of a sudden at greater rates? Were they more tasty? They hadn't even started to supersize back then. Why did people all of a sudden suck up about 240 or 50 more calories a day? Now the calories in, calories out folks will tell you, well, it's easy. People ate more, that's why they got fat. Yeah, but why did they eat more? What happened? What all of a sudden kicked this thing into gear and made everybody suck down the carbohydrates? And that's kind of what we're going to talk about. And we're going to look at what has happened to the fat intake. Now, if you look at this, and I kind of apologize for this, this is, you've heard of piss poor PowerPoint. This is piss poor graphing from Excel. That was my first attempt at a graph from Excel. I could have grabbed one offline, but I wanted to make sure it was accurate. And this looks at the change in fat. Even though fat hasn't changed, the quality of the fat that we've eaten has changed. And this is vegetable oil consumption, and it has absolutely skyrocketed. And if you look at over the same time that we've been gaining all this weight. So if you look at that, that's vegetable oil consumption. And most of it, and we've seen this chart from Nina and a bunch of other people this week, and most of it comes from soybean oil. All right, and so we're placing, since the fat intake hasn't changed, or fat content of the diet hasn't changed much, what's changed is the makeup of the fat in the diet. And we've switched to a lot more vegetable oils. And if you look at this chart, this is vegetable oils plus vegetable shortening. The last one was just vegetable oils, just liquid oils. This is with vegetable shortening added. Now I wanted to show on this, because this is grams per person per day on the y-axis on the left, I wanted to show what the saturated fat consumption did over the same time, but it's really difficult to find out because when you go to the Economic Research Service, you get presented with tons of data, but it's difficult to tease out because they've got the oils, because oils are manufactured, so they can say how much soybean oil and how much cottonseed oil and how much lard and how much this and how much that and butter and all the rest. But when you come down to fats and meat, it's hard because they give you the per capita consumption of beef, of lamb, of pork, of chickens, of turkey. So you'd have to go in on each one of those and tease out the percentage of saturated fat and then make a graph. And I didn't have the time or the will to do that. But what I did, because I wanted to superimpose them on the same graph so we could see what it looked like. So instead, as a surrogate, I just took beef consumption. And if you look at beef consumption, and this is really stunning, this is beef consumption over the same period of time. So just recently, we've started eating more vegetable oils than we have beef. That's hard to believe. I mean, that is a stunning graph to me. Now, why is this all happening? Well, a couple of reasons. One reason is that we're eating out more. And when you eat out, you lose all control over what you eat. Now, you may order a steak and some sauteed asparagus, but you don't know what they sauteed it in, and you don't know what they seared the steak in. And right now, there are many people eating away from home as there are eating at home. When I was a kid, I never went to a restaurant until I was in the 7th grade, other than if we were traveling somewhere, we would stop. But every meal was at home, and we prepared everything at home. And now half the people go out to eat and lose all control over what they get. Not all control, because they can order a steak or whatever, but they don't know what it's cooked, what any of this stuff is cooked in. And so I was trying to find this out, so I went undercover in a restaurant to do this. And this was a few years back before I decided to start coloring my hair gray. And but I went to one of these deals where you can pay and go in and kind of become a pseudo chef for a night and work in the back under the tutelage of the chef and help fix stuff. So that's what I did, and my wife did it too, and we went in and had a good time. But meanwhile, I snooped around because I was really curious to see what kind of fats they were using. And sure enough, here's what I found: heavy-duty canola liquid frying oil and soybean salad oil. And that's what they cook everything in. And I asked the chef, and he said, yeah, I like the canola oil, but the other place I've worked, most of them use the soybean oil. And so that's what you get your stuff cooked in. That's what you get your salad dressings made in. When they bring you your little thing of olive oil to the table, A, you don't know that that's real olive oil that hasn't been adulterated, because there's a huge problem with olive oil adulteration right now. And B, that's a little tiny bit of olive oil. All your other stuff is slathered in soybean oil. So we're eating a lot more oils because we're eating out. And we're getting a particularly pernicious oil, because if you look at canola oil, it's 32% linoleic acid. And I'll give you a preview. I'm going to lay a lot of the blame on what's going on linoleic acid. So you get 32% on canola oil. You get 61% in soybean oil. And if you get good old beef fat, you get about 4%. Okay, and a lot of stuff used to be, as another number of speakers have talked about, a lot of stuff used to be cooked in beef fat. If you look at this graph by Stephen Guyanet, he went out and pulled together a bunch of studies that measured linoleic acid content in fat, okay, in our fat, in subcutaneous fat, in human fat. And what we can see is from the time of 1960 to 2010, it's increased markedly. So that means we really have been eating a lot of linoleic acid, whether we want to or not. And this just shows, this graph's adipose versus consumption. Okay, now let's look at this chart. And this chart is easy to jump to conclusions from. This is a chart, this is the prevalence of obesity among US adults aged 20 to 74, and the chart next to it is the consumption of vegetable oil. Now this could be like the marriages in Maine and whatever it was that Nina was talking about. Correlation is not causation, but when you see something like this, and it's not, and it's in the same realm, in this case, of what we eat, it makes you look a little bit closer. And clearly vegetable fats are correlative, but are they causative? And if so, how? Now, a lot of this problem we can lay at the doorstep of our good friend Ansel Keys, who we've all talked about all through this conference, who was the sort of the leading nutritionist of the 20th century, and he's even lapped over now because people are still enthralled with his work. But he was the one he demonized saturated fat, and he got us all eating these vegetable oils. And you can see how the attitude has changed in saturated fat over the time. Attitude prior to 1980, what did we all think about saturated fat? This was the attitude we had. Remember Alfred E. Newman from Mad Magazine? Nobody thought about it. If you asked somebody back in 1976, how much saturated fat in that, what, me worry? And it's changed because our attitude towards saturated fat after 1980, after the government got involved, after the nutritional guidelines, after they started promoting low-fat diets, our attitude changed. And it became scared to death of saturated fats. And so, but because we were scared of it, we have gone along with all these guidelines. We've been plucky little soldiers. Here's a graph that Nina generously sent me, and you can see in kind of the greenish blue, those are the things that we've been told to eat more of, and we have, and in the red are things we've been told to eat less of, and we've eaten less of them. So we've gone right along like the lemmings we are. And if you look over here at saturated or at fatty intake, you can see the fat intake has fallen off. That's in the dark blue, and the kind of aquamarine is carb intake. The holy grail is to get your carbs above 55%. We haven't quite gotten there, and to get fat below 30%, and we still haven't quite gotten there yet either. But these, as I say, are in percentages, which I hate. But this is saturated fat, and this is what's happened to saturated fat. Now this starts in 71, the graph above it started in 65, and you notice the big drop off in fat from 65 to 71. But just in this graph from 71 on, if you look at it, there's been about a 20.5% decrease in saturated fat. So I went back and extrapolated and said, okay, I'm sure that we were eating more saturated fat in 65 because we were eating more fat in 65, and I kind of cobbled together this graph, and it looks like it's about a 25% intake, and I don't know what that is actually in absolute values, how many fewer grams we're eating today than we were then, but it's pretty substantial. And so the big changes since 1980 are that linoleic acid consumption has gone way, way up, saturated fat consumption has gone down, and the calories we've consumed, primarily carbohydrate calories, have gone up. And so it's kind of the perfect storm. We've got this wholesale adoption of vegetable oils, we've got increased consumption of refined carbs, and we've got the demonization of saturated fat. So my hypothesis then is linoleic acid promotes obesity, which this is nothing that's, half the other people haven't said up here. This is nothing, no great insight. The problem is, how does it promote obesity? What's the mechanism? And that's what we're going to talk about, what I think the mechanism is. The other thing is saturated fat protects against obesity. We've gone from who cares to the guy screaming about saturated fat. Now we've kind of come around, a lot of people are still screaming about saturated fat out of fear. Now we've come around to this notion that, well, maybe saturated fats are neutral. But I'm going to hypothesize, or I'm going to posit that saturated fats protect against obesity and show you how I think that they do. Now, my wife was looking at these slides and says, if you throw these up there, they're going to think you're one of these idiots. The Batman, I cut my carbs to almost zero and I'll still can't lose. Fool, I told you there's more to the equation than just cutting carbs. So I go back and I've got to add to the hypothesis. And in addition to these things, I'm a big believer in the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis, and I think that's the cornerstone of everything. So I haven't, gone off the rails and gone face down in the carbs. I just think that these other things have created a black hole that have sucked all these extra calories in, and I'm going to show you how I think it is. Now, the mechanism for this is tough. And I've been searching for this for a long time, and I have a friend who has has climbed the corporate ladder to the highest echelons, running a huge company at an age when most people are just getting into middle management. And I asked him, I said, how did you do this? How did you get there so fast? And he said, well, I decided early on that what I was going to do was that I was going to only hire people who were smarter than I was. That way I could go to them for answers instead of having them come to me for answers. So I decided to do that same thing because the subset of people who are smarter than I am is enormous. So I had a lot to pick from. And I got a lot of my information from this guy right here, whose name is Peter Dobromilsky, which is difficult to pronounce. He blogs as Hyperlipid. He's got a whole section on protons. He's been fooling with this for 5 or 6 years now. He's a quirky, funny, highly technical blogger. A lot of people don't read his stuff because it's really technical, but I have got a wealth of information, established a correspondence with him excuse me, we send papers back and forth, and this guy, he's a vet in the UK who's retired now, and this is one smart guy. So I wanted to get somebody smarter than I am, and I found that Peter is probably the smartest person in most rooms that he's in. And so I had a lot of help from him in coming up with this mechanism that I'm going to present. And you can find him at highfatnutritionblogspot.com, or just Google hyperlipid and it'll take you to his blog. Okay, now what I'm going to do with this is crossing a chasm. You can see how cleverly I've photoshopped my face into this. So that's me hanging out there. And what we're going to go to from what we know for pretty sure, or really know for sure, again to what we know for pretty sure, and we're going to kind of cross the chasm and close that gap with what we're going to talk about today. Now I want to talk about life. This is life simplified, okay? You get food, there's somebody that's tearing his hamburger apart to get rid of the bun, good low carber, get rid of the bun and keep all the other good stuff, so that's food. Food converts to ATP. ATP gives us life. All right, and what happens with this is we've got the sun. The sun makes plants grow. The plants start out as little bitty seeds, and they take the energy of the sun and they build these chemical bonds to make the plants, to make plant protein, and to make the carbohydrates in the plants. Animals eat the plants and break down these bonds, and they use the bonds to fuel their own growth. We eat the animals as food, and we eat the plants for food, and it all came from the sun. So we literally eat the sun every time we eat. That's where the energy comes from. And we take this food, and what we do with it is that we break it down into high energy electrons. And these high energy electrons we then use to create the ATP, which is the currency of life. Now we do all this in the mitochondria. And we can make some ATP outside the mitochondria in the cytosol, but not a lot. About 85 to 90% of it is made in the mitochondria. And it's made in one specific part of the mitochondria. It's made in the intermitochondrial membrane and the intramembrane space. And get ready for this. This is my graphic that I put together. This is the top line is the outer mitochondrial membrane with the cytoplasm of the cell outside that. The intermitochondrial membrane, the matrix, and inside is the intramembranous space. And all these little things, the colorful things you see down at the bottom are complexes of one sort or another that transfer these high energy electrons that we throw off when we break down food. And what happens, and I just noticed that ETF, which is electron transfer flavoprotein, should be actually up in the, nudged up into the membrane. How did I do that? It's a huge embarrassment. Anyway, what ends up happening is that you get an electron brought in by NADH into complex 1. Complex 1 hands that off to the CoQ couple. Complex 2 gives you an FADH, and ETF gives you the same thing. It gives you another FADH, transfers high energy electrons, reduces the CoQ couple. Then the CoQ couple passes, we've got the glycerol 3-phosphate shuttle, which that can actually convert NAD outside the cytoplasm into the intermitochondrial membrane. We're not going to fool with that for the purpose of the discussion. I just put it in there for completeness, but it comes. Then that hands it off to complex 3, it goes to cytochrome, goes to complex 4, and all this going along. These are high energy electrons that lose a little bit of their energy as they go from one step to the next in this. And the energy that's lost, that they give up, is used to pump protons from one side of this membrane to the other. Okay, and you've got all these protons. These are hydrogen atoms, positively charged hydrogen atoms. And in this picture, they're kind of evenly distributed, but what happens is that they get pumped when these high energy electrons go around, and they get pumped through these complexes. They get pumped through all the complexes except for complex 2. They get pumped through 3, they get pumped through 4, and they get pumped until there's a lot higher concentration in the space than there is below the space. And when you got two differences in concentration, it always wants to equalize. And the difference in those concentrations is called delta psi. And they want to come back through. They want to come back through, so they're putting tremendous pressure on this inner mitochondrial membrane to get back through to the other side. Because not only is it a chemical imbalance, you got more hydrogens up there than you do below, you've actually got more electricity. You've got all these positive charges, so the positive charge wants to discharge. And so what it does is it comes back down through this complex 5. And it does it, they come zipping through this complex 5, and you can see them come zipping through there. And this complex 5 is a little turbine, a little molecular turbine that turns whenever one of these hydrogens zips down through it. And it doesn't go fill up, discharge, fill up, discharge. This is constantly going on because we're constantly pumping high energy electrons along this electron transport chain. And so what you see in this is, if you look, this is this complex 5. This is what it looks like. This is a molecular model. It's upside down to the way I have presented it there. But it turns when these hydrogen ions go whipping through there. It turns this, and this throws off ATP. And this is where the majority of our ATP comes from. These things turn 150 revolutions per second. And these are scattered all across the inner mitochondrial membrane of all the mitochondria and all the cells. There are thousands of mitochondria in each cell and billions of cells. So you can imagine that each revolution they're cranking off an ATP. So these things churn out your body weight in ATP daily. I weigh about 195 pounds. So if my day goes okay, I'll make 195 pounds of ATP. I mean, it's really phenomenal when you think about it. And that's where our energy comes from. So when we go back to here and we see an NADH coming in, that's a high energy electron carrier. It goes to the CoQ couple, same for 2, embarrassingly the ETF, which isn't embedded in the membrane. That passes it off to 3 and 4 and goes on down the way. But what if you overload the CoQ couple? The CoQ couple is a really important crossroads in this. And you're reducing the CoQ couple every time you hand an electron off to it, okay? So when you reduce the CoQ couple, what if the CoQ couple gets fully reduced and you're still trying to put electrons in through NADH? It says, and it ships them back, and that's called reverse electron transport. And when you have reverse electron transport, it ends up popping off a free radical, a superoxide in this case. Now you may think, oh my God, a free radical, it's the free radical theory of aging, this is killing us. But it really isn't. This is a you can see it over here. I've kind of made it smaller. The superoxide gets converted to hydrogen peroxide. It diffuses through the mitochondria and it goes into the cell. And it acts as a signaling molecule. Okay, these reactive oxygen species act as signaling molecules. They're not just harmful things. And what they do, one of the things they do is they increase mitochondrial biosynthesis. We all want to increase the number of mitochondria we have. Something we absolutely want to do. You can do it by exercise, and actually you can do it by eating right, because you want to increase mitochondrial biosynthesis. The reason we know that from a great paper by Nick Lane is it's been shown that antioxidants lower the ROS leak. At the same time, they decrease the amount of mitochondrial DNA, and they decrease ATP synthesis. We want as many mitochondria as we can get, and when we can get them is popping off free radicals. Now, this whole free radical thing causes localized insulin resistance, and this is the key to this whole explanation that's going forward, because the hydrogen peroxide inhibits autophosphorylation of the insulin receptor and creates local insulin resistance. Now, I'm not talking about total body insulin resistance. That's what we've been talking about this whole conference when we're talking about measuring insulin. That's total body insulin resistance. I'm talking about local insulin resistance at the level of an individual cell. And that can be protective against excess nutrients going into the cell. And it's one way cells have to prevent taking in too much stuff that they don't want. And this thing explains a whole lot. It explains physiological insulin resistance. You know, a lot of people have been talking about that. What does that mean? If you starve what ends up happening is that because you're not pumping any food down, you're only pumping down your own broken down fat, and you're making ketones, and ketones really reduce the difference in charge across the inner membrane. It reduces delta psi to very small amounts, and in very small amounts you can't activate the insulin receptor because it takes a little pulse of this superoxide of ROS to generate a little bit of insulin that you need. And so if you don't generate insulin activity, and if you don't generate insulin activity, you can't bring glucose into the cells, because you don't want to bring glucose into the cells, because you've got to conserve those for red blood cells and other tissues that can only use glucose. So you can explain local physiological insulin resistance this way. The same thing happens with low carb dieting. You do have a bigger pressure gradient, a bigger delta psi there, but because, as we'll see, the FADH, which come from fat breakdown, really drive this reverse electron transport. So because if you're on a low carb diet, the low carb part of the diet means you're not taking in a lot of glucose, so you need to conserve what you have for the glucose, for the tissues that are obligate glucose consumers. So this whole reverse electron transport explains a whole lot. Now, how do we generate FADH2 and NADH? Now, I've gone overboard on this, so I'm going to go really quickly through it. And this is a 16 carbon saturated fat. This is palmitic acid. You can tell it's a fat because it's got the hydroxyl group on it. To get it into the mitochondria where this all happens, you've got to swap that out for an acyl group, and that's when the whole fat gets activated. Dr. Bigman talked yesterday about how you had to use carnitine to get the fat into the mitochondria. So the fat's in the mitochondria, and what happens is it gets broken down by a process called beta-oxidation, and it cleaves it off at this 2-carbon molecule right here. And so it chops off 2 carbons at a time until the fatty acid is completely oxidized. I'm going to go through this quickly and only one time. So here's beta oxidation. It's a 4-step process. There are only 2 steps that we're concerned about. And that's this one right here, because that creates FADH. That's a dehydrogenation, and it converts that single bond into a double bond, rips off a couple of hydrogens, and loads up FADH2. And that's one of the molecules that carts them to the electron transport chain. The other important part is the NADH, because it does that. So each 16 carbon saturated fat completes 7 cycles of beta oxidation, each creating an acetyl-CoA, because when this is chopped off, it's chopped off to 2 carbons in the acyl group, which makes this an acetyl-CoA. And it gives you 7 FADH2s, because a 16 carbon just goes through 7 beta oxidation processes, because at the end it's left with an acetyl-CoA. So it doesn't have to go through 8, it just goes through 7, because what's left over is an acetyl-CoA. So it goes through this process that you see on the left only 7 times. So it generates 7 FAD2s, 7 NADHs, and 8 acetyl-CoA. All right, now what happens next is that the acetyl-CoA all go into the Krebs cycle, which is also in the mitochondria and close by. And when the acetyl-CoA go into the Krebs cycle, they go around the Krebs cycle, and what they do is they throw off 3 NADHs for each acetyl-CoA that goes through, and they throw off 1 FADH2. Okay, so what ends up happening is you got 8 FADHs, because you got 8 acetyl-CoAs going around. You got 24 NADHs, and that gives you a total of 15 FADH2s and 31 NADHs. If you divide those out, and this is the crux of this whole thing, if you divide those out, you come up with an FN ratio of 0.8 on a saturated fat. Pardon me?
0.48.
What did I say?
8. Go ahead.
Oh, 0.48. Sorry, I've got my cue card person up here. 0.48. And that's an important ratio, because that's a saturated fat, and that's highly generative of reverse electron transport. Now remember, the FADHs all come from fat breakdown. And if you look at the beta oxidation of a palmitoleic acid, you can see that that's got a double bond in the middle. You cleave it off the same way. You go through the same process, and you chop down, except when you get to that double bond, there's already a double bond. So you don't have to do the part with the FADH. You don't have to make a double bond. You've got a couple of enzymes that twist this thing around and get it back into sync without making the double bond. So you have one fewer FADH. So you got 6, 7 NADH, 8 acetyl-CoA, just like we did before. After running all these things through the Krebs cycle, you end up going through all this, and you end up with FN ratio of 0.45. Now I'm really going to scream through this because we don't need to go through all this. It's just showing that oleic acid, which is what you find in olive oil, has got an FN ratio of 0.46. Linoleic acid, the fat we love to hate, has an FN ratio of 0.43. Now neither the 0.43 does not generate reverse electron transport. Okay. Now the 4.6 is iffy. That's a monounsaturated fat. You've only lost one FADH2, and it can generate a little bit. So here are the way they're laid out. This shows that palmitic acid and saturated fats in general really create a lot with this 4.8, oleic acid a little bit, palmitoleic acid none, and linoleic acid none, and glucose really none. So this is kind of a switch that throws whether you're going to have reverse electron transport or not. And when you get back up and look at the complex and glucose runs through, it goes just NADH, a little FADH2. It goes through, doesn't reduce the CoQ couple that much. You get no reverse electron transport, no local insulin resistance, and so the glucose goes right into the cell. If you get linoleic acid, you get no reverse electron transport, no local insulin resistant, and it goes right into the cell, and it actually acts like a supercharged carbohydrate because it's got 9 calories versus 4 for a carbohydrate. If you look at oleic acid, that's the monounsaturated fat, it's plus or minus, it can throw off a little bit, mild local insulin resistance, so it serves a little bit to keep fat out of the cells and to prevent too many nutrients going into the cell or more than the cell wants. If you get palmitic acid, you get major reverse electron transport and large local insulin resistance. So this is a saturated fat. And when your fat cells start to get enough and you're eating saturated fat, it shuts it off. Now let's look at the adipose cell, and let's look at a McDonald's fries cooked in beef tallow like they used to be cooked, okay? And beef is mainly stearic acid, and stearic acid is an 18 carbon fat, so it's 0.49, so it's going to create even more reverse electron transport than the palmitic acid does. So it's stearic acid and glucose starts from the French fries. So what happens, you eat those, your cell grows a little bit because it's taken in the fat, then reverse electron transport steps in and says, I'm sending the rest of it back to the circulation. And what that does, the circulation's got to get rid of it somehow, so it kind of gins up its energy production, so you have increased energy expenditure, and you have a hunger reduction because all the stuff isn't getting sucked into the fat cell, so you don't eat as much. Now, if you make these things with vegetable oil, linoleic acid plus glucose, here's what you get. You get the fat cell grows to monstrous sizes because there's no reverse electron transport to start it. And so the adipose cell really expands. And here's a really interesting study that's a terrible study, but it demonstrates this. This was an idiotic study where they were trying to show all kinds of different carbohydrate intakes with different glycemic indices, see if they had any effect on appetite, and it turned out it really didn't. It wasn't the way they controlled it, was kind of screwy. But anyway, what they did is they had 2 different studies. They had 2 different groups of kids, 11 to 15 years old, that they wrote in on 5 different weekends, and they fed them these different carbohydrate meals. And they fed them to them, they would give them rice, or they would give them baked potatoes, or they would give them French fries. And what they did was they gave it to them one meal along with about, 100 calories or 150 calories of meatballs, and they let them eat it, and then they let them keep asking for more carbohydrate until they had eaten all they wanted. And then they calculated how many calories they had eaten. And so they did this on 2 different groups of people, all using themselves as their own control. And what you get down here, what's really interesting, here is baked potatoes made with butter. They took these baked potatoes, they're not baked potatoes, boiled potatoes mashed with milk and butter, and you look at the caloric intake to satiation there. And when you look at French fries, these are French fries cooked in canola oil, okay? And 2 different study groups that were all randomized, all were their own controls throughout, but 2 different experiments with 2 completely different groups of kids, and you found the same thing. Look at the difference in calorie intake in feeding to satiation. 707 calories, around 700 calories versus 1,100 calories. And the only difference is, one was with butter, a saturated fat that creates reverse electron transport. The other with canola oil that's got a lot of linoleic acid that says, hey, baby, come on into the fat cell. Now, if you go on a low-carb diet, you got a lot of stearic acid and glucose. That goes into the cell, it raises it up a little bit. You got reverse electron transport. It says back to circulation, increases EE, and it reduces hunger, and it spares glucose for the glucose tissues you need. So the system works perfectly. And what happens with adipose cells when they get huge because you've been consuming linoleic acid and sucking all this stuff in there, the adipose cell gets large, and it finally, we don't know if it's because it reaches a critical size, because of adipose triglyceride lipase and perilipin A, which is a protein that works with ATGL. One or the other of these says, okay, enough. I don't care if I don't have local insensitivity, you ain't put any more stuff in here. So then it starts releasing it, and it starts releasing non-esterified fatty acids into the circulation, and those go to the viscera, the very place you don't want them to go, because we're in the viscera. That's called ectopic fat. Ectopic fat is fat where it shouldn't be. And ectopic fat is like having a big splinter. It's a big inflammation. It causes your body doesn't recognize that as self. It recognizes it as foreign because it's not supposed to be there. It recruits macrophages. You can see the macrophages that come in there. You get macrophage infiltration of cells. The macrophages call out for more macrophages, and the macrophages can be 50 to 60% of the fat cell mass. Just think about that. And you wonder why it causes inflammation? Okay, so reverse electron transport protects the fat cells and others from overnutrition. Saturated fat drives reverse electron transport. It's a beneficial macronutrient. Linoleic acid prevents reverse electron transport and allows the cells to fill with fat. This is what I think this giant increase in carb consumption came from when we all went to eating vegetable oils, this very mechanism. Linoleic acid should be avoided, so here are my recommendations. Cut the carbs first. If you cut the carbs, you get rid of most processed foods, and processed foods are where you find vegetable oils. Meticulously avoid linoleic acid. Eat more at home. If you want to use salad dressings, use macadamia nut oil. That's a good one. If you were from the South, you would know about wilted salads. You take bacon and you fry it up, and you crumble the bacon, you put it on the salad, then you pour the hot bacon grease on the salad, and it wilts it. It's fabulous. You can try that so you don't have to have salad dressings. And eat more saturated fat. And I thank you very much for your attention.